Okay. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, as always, to Miriam for organizing. The topic tonight is Lulav and Esrog. Um, in no, not in order of most important to least important questions, just trying to organize them. This is a really good question. May one buy the cheapest Lulav and Esrog set, i.e., junior lever for an adult? That's a fair question. So the Shul Lulav and Esrog options, and this is a pretty common set of options, to the best of my recollection, are Aleph, Beis, Gimel, and Chinuch. So let's just try to understand what's going on between what are the four ranges? What are the four ranges? So my understanding, thank God I interact with Josh Brightson a lot about the Lulav and Esrogim. So my understanding is as follows: that Aleph, Beis, and Gimel are all kosher. Aleph, Beis, and Gimel are all kosher. I'll just say as an aside that we have a standing arrangement that if I can't I can't take responsibility to look at every Lulav and Esrog that he sells. I just can't take responsibility for that. I do sort of a spot check of different ones. I come through and look at his merchandise at different times, more than for myself. In other words, I'm just checking different parts from the Aleph, from the base, from the Gimel. I can't take responsibility for checking all of them, but we do have an agreement that if somebody thought there might be a problem with their personal Lulav and Esrog, and they show it to me, and I agree that it's problematic, then Josh will honor that. But the bottom line is Aleph, Beis, and Gimel are all kosher. So what's the difference between Aleph and Gimel? So this is an idea. It's called Hidur Mitzvah. Hidur Mitzvah is a beautifying of the mitzvah. One of the most famous sources for Hidur Mitzvah is it's actually a pasuk from the splitting of the sea, when the Jew, not or from the song of praise the Jewish people sang after the splitting of the sea, that they say in the Oz Yashir, Zeh Keli V'Anveyu. This is my God, and I will beautify him. And we say the idea of this is my God and I will beautify him. The Gemara says the pshat is hisnoeh lefanav b'mitzvos. Beautify yourself before him in mitzvos. It's a very real idea. It was not a started by a bookstore owner, Hidur Mitzvah. It's a real concept that shows up in the Gemara, that to try that my mitzvah items should be uniquely beautiful. It's not only for Lulav and Esrog, it's for all kinds of things. So if you got a Gimel, it's kosher. If you got a Gimel, it's kosher. But Bays, generally speaking, looks a little bit nicer than Gimel, and Aleph normally looks nicer than Bays. Um, it's interesting. What are the type of things that we're talking about when we're talking about Hidur Mitzvah anyway? What does it mean? What does it mean? An Aleph Esrog. By the way, as an aside, not all sellers do this, but for Josh, the to the best of my recollection, the Lulavim are the same, Aleph, Beis, and Gimel. Um, the Hadassim, the Hadassim actually are a higher halachic standard, um, definitely for the Aleph. There's different ways to sort of measure the there's a thing with the Hadassim that the three leaves, in other words, there's supposed to be three parallel leaves with the Hadassim. For how much are there three parallel leaves? So the Aleph is actually going by a stricter standard. So that's interesting. So the Aleph, it's a higher halachic standard. In other words, I would say the Beis and Gimel are kosher in terms of the Hadassim, but the Aleph is a higher halachic standard. The Esrogim, all of the Esrogim through Aleph through Gimel should be kosher. Um, the Esrogim, it's more an issue of beauty. It could be, I'll just give a few examples of what might be the type of things that would set an Aleph Esrog apart. It could be the shape of the Esrog is very symmetrical. It's interesting. There are some people who are very into various bumps on the esrog. They feel that connects to the beauty, the color of an esrog, sort of a strong, very bright, yellow or sometimes green. All these things could factor into the overall beauty of an esrog. And if you look again, it's not only for Josh, but it is true for Josh, that if you picked up an average Aleph Esrog, or you did a survey of the Aleph Esrogim, you would see that the Aleph Esrogim would sort of stand out in one or more of these respects. And the Gimel, it's kosher. It's kosher. None of these things that I just mentioned would impact whether or not the esrog is kosher. You'd be yotze without any of these things, but it just has a general feel of a more beautiful esrog. That is for Aleph through Gimel. So Chinuch set is a different story. Chinuch set, what I normally agree on with Josh is that the chinuch set is something that I would say is arguably kosher. In other words, it's something. It is sometimes, thank God, Josh has more kosher lulav and esrogim that he knows what to do with, but sometimes it's a little bit of a tighter thing. So the idea of a lulav or esrog that's fundamentally puzzle, it's bad chinuch to give that to a child. It's not appropriate chinuch to give a puzzle lulav or esrog to a child. That would not be correct. But let's say it's something, sometimes these things are borderline. So he'll show me sometimes, like Josh will initiate with me. He'll show me, a given lulav or esrog and say, what do you say about this? I had a question about this. Rabbi, what do you say? So sometimes I'll tell him I think it's kosher. Might not be uniquely beautiful, but I think it's kosher. Sometimes I'll tell him I think it's puzzle. Sometimes I'll tell him, I think it's really borderline. So something, I think it's really borderline. We look at each other, we say, okay, that's good for chinuch. In other words, it could very well be a person's yotze with it, but we wouldn't give it to someone who's buying it as a bar or bas mitzvah. But for a child, it's good. It's good enough for a child. But something that we would say, oh, that's puzzle, we wouldn't put in the chinuch set either. Okay, I hope that's making sense to everybody. The chinuch set, of course, I just want to translate. Chinuch literally means education. The chinuch set is intended for a child under bar mitzvah. If a parent wants to get lulav and esrog for a child, they get them chinuch set. Okay, really, really interesting question. So I see the advertisement for Lulav and Esrog in Shul, and I see an advertisement for communal tzedakah needs for Yom Tov. So I shrug my shoulders and I say, I could spend less on my Lulav and Esrog. I could get a Gimel Lulav and Esrog, and I could give the difference to tzedakah. Which one is better? Is it better to get an Aleph Lulav and Esrog and give a little bit less to tzedakah? Or is it better to give a Gimel Lulav and Esrog and give a little more to tzedakah? It's an interesting question. The question is assuming that a person can afford, let's say, the amount of the Aleph. Obviously, if a person can't afford the amount of the Aleph, they should feel free to get a Gimel. They shouldn't feel bad about it. But if a person can afford the amount of the Aleph, I would say it's better to give to get the Aleph and spend the extra money on Hidur Mitzvah. As we've said, Hidur Mitzvah is a very real thing. Okay. Okay, this is a great question. Okay. If you have 3 children and 1 Lulav and Esrog for the 3 children, what do you do? Now, want to explain where I'm pretty sure the question is coming from. So there's halacha on the first day of Sukkot that the Torah talks about the mitzvah of Lulav and Esrog, and it says, "Ulakachtem lochem bayom harishon." You should take for yourselves on the first day of Sukkot, pri'etz hadar kapos tamarim v'anafei tzavos v'arvei nochal. Take the 4 species. Now this usmachtem, L'fnei Hashem Elokeichem Shivas Yomim. And you should rejoice before Hashem for 7 days. I'm terribly sorry to interrupt, but I can't see the Birth of Spiro box without shouting out to Mrs. Spiro. It would be even nicer to see you, but it's wonderful to see your name. Thank you for joining us, Mrs. Spiro. Thank you to everyone for joining us, but Mrs. Spiro, it's a different category. It's moved on to New York, so it's always nice to see you with us. Thank you for joining us, Mrs. Spiro. Okay, and thank you for the pre-written speeches over the last 3 months. I appreciate that too. Okay, that was just a joke. When the Torah describes the mitzvah of Lulav and Esrog, it says you should do it on the first day of Sukkot. Then the Torah proceeds to say, rejoice before Hashem for 7 days. So which is it? Is it the first day of Sukkot or the 7 days of Sukkot? I want to remind everybody that in the Torah there's 7 days of Sukkot. Shmini Atzeres is the 8th day in the Torah, and that's a different Yom Tov. So we learned the following halacha, which is really interesting. In the Beis Hamikdash, there was a Torah mitzvah to do Lulav and Esrog for 7 days. And that's indeed, in the context of the mitzvah of the 4 species, it says, you should rejoice before Hashem 7 days. Where's before Hashem? In the Beis Hamikdash. Now, the beginning of the pasuk says, take on the first day. So what it means, take on the first day, is all of Klal Yisrael has a mitzvah to take Lulav and Esrog wherever they are on the first day of Sukkot. The Torah mitzvah is only the first day. I should clarify, by the way, I said all of Klal Yisrael. That was not accurate. Women are actually not obligated in Lulav and Esrog. Women are welcome to do Lulav and Esrog. Like any mitzvah that women are not obligated, if women do it, they get merit for it. But women are not obligated in Lulav and Esrog. The reason women are not obligated in Lulav and Esrog is it's a positive time-bound mitzvah. Lulav and Esrog is only a mitzvah during the day. It's only a mitzvah during Sukkos. So women are exempt from it. But all men, all halachic men, wherever they are in the world, have a mitzvah from the Torah to do Lulav and Esrog on the first day of Sukkos. We do Lulav and Esrog the entirety of Sukkos. Why? It's a rabbinic thing. It's Zecher LeMikdash, to commemorate what happened in the Beis Hamikdash. So the mitzvah that we have of doing Lulav and Esrog on the 4th day of Sukkot is rabbinic. But in the Beis Hamikdash, the mitzvah of Lulav and Esrog on the 4th day of Sukkot was a Torah level mitzvah. Fine. When the Torah says that all the men of Klal Yisrael have a mitzvah to do Lulav and Esrog on the first day, there's a very interesting aspect of that instruction. It says, Ulekachtem lochem, you should take for yourselves. And we learn a very interesting thing from that phrase, Ulekachtem lochem. And what we learn from that phrase is you can only fulfill the mitzvah of Lulav and Esrog if it's yours. If it doesn't belong to you, you are not yotzei the mitzvah of Lulav and Esrog by Yom HaRishon, specifically on the first day. I want to be clear, even though the Torah gives a mitzvah of Lulav and Esrog in the Beis Hamikdash for each day of Sukkos, it doesn't have to belong to you on the 4th day of Sukkos in the Beis Hamikdash either. Because only by the first day does it say you should take for yourself, which we say means that you have the mitzvah, or you fulfill the mitzvah only if you own the Lulav and Esrog. Okay, so what that means is, on the first day of Sukkos and Shul, if I don't have a Lulav and Esrog, for whatever reason I don't have a Lulav and Esrog, and you fulfilled the mitzvah of Lulav and Esrog already, and I turn to you and I say, may I have your Lulav and Esrog? I shouldn't be asking if I can borrow your Lulav and Esrog. I should be asking if I can have your Lulav and Esrog, and you should be giving it to me. It should be my Lulav and Esrog, because that's the way I'll fulfill the mitzvah. By the way, we said a moment ago that women are not obligated in the mitzvah of Lulav and Esrog, but if a woman wants to fulfill the mitzvah of Lulav and Esrog on the first day of Sukkos, so though she doesn't have to be doing this, if she wants to fulfill the mitzvah, the way to fulfill the mitzvah is to ask someone who either to have purchased the Lulav and Esrog herself, or to ask someone else, would you please give me the Lulav and Esrog? Okay. Now, there's a very interesting thing, which is that we in the diaspora don't only have one day of Yom Tov at the beginning. We, of course, in the diaspora have 2 days of Yom Tov at the beginning of Sukkot. In Israel, they only have one day of Yom Tov at the beginning of Sukkot. But we have 2 days of Yom Tov at the beginning of Sukkot. So, what does that teach us? Or not what does that teach us, but what is the rule that comes from there? The whole idea of the second day of Yom Tov in the diaspora is this is sort of on the possibility that maybe the first day of Yom Tov wasn't really the first day of Yom Tov, which means we should treat the second day of Yom Tov like it's the first day of Yom Tov. And therefore, we're particular that on both of the first 2 days of Yom Tov, a person who's being Yotzei with Lulav and Esrog should own the Lulav and Esrog. So, what that means is, if you're standing next to me in Shul, and you don't have a Lulav and Esrog, and I'm done with my Lulav and Esrog, and you say to me, could you please give me your Lulav and Esrog? And I'm glad to accommodate. So I give you the Lulav and Esrog. If I have my head on my shoulders, I'll say, now give it back. Because tomorrow I need it to be mine, Lulav and Esrog. Right? So really for the first 2 days, for us in the diaspora, one is only Yotzei if it's their Lulav and Esrog. So now to the question. So the question is as follows. I want to be mechanech my child. I want to educate my under bar or bas mitzvah child in the mitzvah of Lulav and Esrog. So I come home from shul, and I want to give them a Lulav and Esrog. Okay, well, on the first 2 days of Sukkot, part of performing the mitzvah of Lulav and Esrog is for someone to give me the Lulav and Esrog. Okay, so I want to teach my child that that's part of the mitzvah of Lulav and Esrog on the first days of Sukkot. So I give my child the Lulav and Esrog. There's a very interesting complication with children in halacha. There's all kinds of complications with children in halacha, but at least for our discussion, there's a complication because at a relatively young age, a child halachically may acquire something given them, but they may not give to someone else. To give something requires more das, requires more of a halachic level of knowledge than to receive. When you think about it, if I'm giving you something, so I'm parting with something. So I'm making the decision to give something to you, and you're just accepting it. That does not require the same level of knowledge as to decide to give it to someone else. So this is the problem. If there's 3 under bar or bas mitzvah children waiting at the dining room table, and I give it to the first child, the child halachically can't really give it to the next child. So what kind of chinuch is that? And then, by the way, just to reinforce the first point we were making, there's a bigger problem because it's the first day of Sukkot. I need this to be my Lulav and Esrog tomorrow. So, but now it belongs to this kid who can't even give it to me if he wants to. So what to do? So if Josh Breitstein was on, Josh Breitstein would call out the best solution is to get chinuch sets for each of them. In other words, if you get chinuch sets for each of them, then you're set. That of course is the ideal solution. It is one of the reasons someone would get a chinuch set for a child. I would not say you're required to do that. But the bottom line is, whatever solution I'm going to say now is not going to be ideal from a halachic perspective, because in some sense it's going to be lacking in the chinuch. So one way to do it is to just hand the child the Lulav and Esrog and not mention one way or the other whether or not you're giving it to them. And you're not giving it to them. I mean, you're physically handing it to them, but you're not transferring ownership. You don't have in mind to transfer ownership to them. Is that lacking in the chinuch? In some sense, it's lacking in the chinuch, but it's in a very subtle way. The other way cited in halacha is you hold the lulav and esrog together with the child. So it's a little bit more that like you're giving to the child, but the point is you never really rescinded your own ownership of it. So the bottom line is I think probably the most practical thing is to just not bring up this thing about you need to own the lulav and esrog to the kids. And you just hand it to them. And they do it, and then they hand it to their sibling, and then they hand it to their sibling. That's what I personally would recommend. Okay. It is not a discussion of Lulav and Esrog unless there's something about what happens if the pitom falls off. So the question posed is what happens if the pitom falls off on the second day of Yom Tov? So first, I just want to give a little bit of an introduction. It's a very well-known thing that it's a big deal about the pitom. It's a big deal about the pitom, so much so that it's very popular to get esrogim without pitoms today, because you have to be less worried about dropping the esrog and the pitom falling off. Now, if the pitom is so important, so why is it okay to get an esrog without a pitom? How does that work? So there's a very interesting machlokes in halacha as to why the pitom is important. I want to clarify something, and this is an important thing to clarify. If you envision an esrog for a second, I'm sorry for not having brought one with me. If you envision an esrog for a second, you have the esrog, and then the pitom, of course, is that stem like at the top of the esrog. Sometimes what happens is the very tip of the stem falls off, but there's still something coming out from the esrog. In other words, there's still a stem coming out from the esrog, but the top of it fell off. Sometimes almost all of it falls off. Here's the bottom line. If something, no matter how minimal, is coming out of the esrog, and by the way, and there's not a hole in the esrog. In other words, if you think about it, you kind of envision the hole. Imagine the hole is filled with this stem, okay, with this little bit of wood, and there's a smidge of the wood coming out above the edge of the hole. If there's even a little bit of it coming out above the edge of the hole, the general consensus in halach is that it's kosher. It might not be ideal, but it's kosher. So I want to just clarify that. So the first thing I want to tell you is when we're, according to sort of mainstream halacha, if we're talking about the pitom fell out, we mean that either there's nothing above the hole, or even if there is something above the hole, what we mean is that like something within the diameter of the circle of the hole of the esrog is missing now. I hope this is being worded clearly. Okay. Okay. So if either something from the hole itself of the esrog is missing, or there's nothing coming out on top of the hole, what is the problem? It's a machlokas lahalacha, and it's so interesting that this machlokas makes a big, big difference. Okay, so first of all, there's a drasha I mentioned before, the word when it comes to the first day of Sukkos, ulakachtem lochem, ulakachtem lochem, take for yourself. The Gemara has a drasha that on the first day of Sukkos, ulakachtem could be reframed as a word lekicha tama, like instead of tem, a separate word, tama, which means pure. That the mitzvah of the four species, the Lulav and Esrog on Sukkos, is to have a lekicha tama, a complete taking. Meaning that on the first day of Sukkos, my mitzvah is that each of the four items, the Lulav, the Esrog, the Adasim, the Aravos, should be complete. And therefore, if the stem is missing, there's one school of thought that says the problem is it's incomplete. And being that it's incomplete, it's not a lekicha tama. Now, if you understand that the issue is it's not a lekicha tama, then it's invalid on the first day of Sukkos. But the requirement of being a lekicha tama is only based on the drasha of ulkachtem, which is for the first day of Sukkos. Which means, according to this, it might not be ideal, but if I lost the pitom, if like the pitom really fell out, and I lost the pitom, according to this, if it happened on the third day of Chol Hamoed Sukkos, I can use it. And it would be fine for me to use it. The $1,000,000 question is, what about the second day of Sukkos? So if you remember, we already mentioned in terms of transferring ownership of Lulav and Esrog, that the standard practice is to treat the second day of Sukkos like the first day of Sukkos. But specifically on this issue of this pretty high level requirement for the Esrog of not being chaser, not being, absent in any way in the Esrog, there, the halacha is that there are different opinions if I have to be particular about that on the second day of Sukkos. In other words, it's clearly, if you hold the idea it's the chaser thing, it's clearly only an issue for the first day of Sukkos. So the question is if the diaspora, if the second day of Sukkos is treated the same way, and therefore we say, I may be yotze with it, but I wouldn't make a bracha on it. People are probably familiar with that in other contexts, that when there's a machlokas in halacha, if I'm yotze with something, we say, I take it for the mitzvah, but I don't make a bracha on it. Now, clearly, if I had access to a perfectly fine esrog, it would be better to use that on the second day of Sukkos. But if it would be difficult for me to get my hands on a good esrog, it would be challenging for me to get my hands on a good esrog, I could use this on the second day of Sukkos and I just wouldn't make a bracha on it. That's all operating under the assumption that the issue with an esrog is lekicha tama, is that it not be chaser, not be missing anything. There's another school of thought. The other school of thought is it's not beautiful for this esrog to be missing the pitom. Again, we're talking about the same standard in terms of either that there's something missing in the circle, in the hole, or that it's not coming up above the hole at all. Now, if you say it's lacking in the beauty of the esrog, well, the Torah describes the esrog as being a pre-eitz hadar, a beautiful fruit. It doesn't only describe the esrog as being a pre-eitz hadar on the first day of Sukkos. That's the description for all of Sukkos. So according to that view, if the pitom was missing, you wouldn't use it on Chol Hamoed Sukkos either. So if one has access to an esrog that has a pitom on Chol Hamoed, it would be better to use it. But if the only thing they had was an esrog without a pitom, they may use it and they may make a bracha on it, on Chol Hamoed. But on the second day, they wouldn't make a bracha on it. Just to come back, by the way, I posed the question at the beginning. If the pitom is so important, how could you have a pitomless esrog? So first of all, just to clarify, we're not talking about someone who took an esrog with a pitom and then pulled it out so they have a pitomless esrog. That would be puzzled. That would definitely be puzzled, certainly on the first day of Sukkos. But if it doesn't naturally have a pitom in the first place, so it's not missing anything. In other words, the idea of being missing is when there's something that it naturally would have that's absent. And if it doesn't naturally have a pitom in the first place, that's not part of its natural beauty. That would be the argument there. Okay. Really, really interesting question. If it's not a Lulav and Esrog discussion without talking about what happens if the pitom falls off, it's also not a Lulav and Esrog discussion if you don't talk about trying to come up with strategies to keep those aravos moist. and keep those aravos fresh. I'll just say as an aside, it's hard to keep kosher aravos throughout Sukkos. Um, if the majority of leaves of the arava for the three tvachim is about 10 inches. If the majority of leaves of the arava in a 10-inch span are either missing or are so dry that that they don't have green in their color anymore, then the aravos are no longer kosher. It's hard to sustain that way over a whole sukkah. I regularly order extra. Josh, it's a nice service. Josh sells if you have to order it at the beginning, but Josh sells extra aravos. So I frequently order extra aravos and just stick it in my refrigerator, and I switch over at some point over sukkahs. Um, so first of all, the questioner asked, do I have any suggestions for you know, I think the person's getting at Aravos. Is there, do I have any suggestions for Aravos? I have no good suggestions for Aravos. I've tried different things over the years. They almost never work. You don't want to talk to me about suggestions for Aravos. My biggest suggestion for Aravos is buy extras, or have a friend who has an Arava tree. Um, um, I'm sorry to say I don't have better suggestions. Somebody asked an interesting question. May a person spray water on the Arava on Yom Tov? So the answer is no. One is not allowed to spray water on the arava. The one thing that a person is allowed to do, it's a Mishnah in um, it's a Mishnah Maseches Sukkah, is if a person has a vase, they put water in it before Yom Tov begins, and it's designated. They that this is what they're going to put the aravos in. So when a person comes home from shul on Yom Tov, doesn't have to be a person comes home from shul. At any point over Yom Tov, person may place the aravos in that vase. They're not supposed to change the water. Or even the changing of the water is considered to be more of a tircha, more of a trouble, and the Rabbanan didn't want that done on Yom Tov. Okay, this is a very interesting question that a person posed. How's one supposed to hold their Lulav and Esrog during Hoshanos? So I'll tell you what the questioner is getting at. And probably many of you have received things in the mail. There's all kinds of, it's the next great fundraiser from various Jewish organizations that they send out this Arava card, by the way, geared to the specific year. And it has, it's always confusing. Which Hoshana do we say which day? So they have those Shanos for that year, like the Hoshanos line for that year. And you can kind of wear it around your wrist. Um, so what are they getting at besides the fact that it's just physically convenient? So the idea of the Lulav and Esrog is primarily a mitzvah that we do. We hold Lulav and Esrog. When we do the mitzvah of Lulav and Esrog, we shake it. But of course, there's an idea of holding the Lulav and Esrog through significant times of davening. We hold the Lulav and Esrog through Hallel if we have a Lulav and Esrog. We hold the Lulav and Esrog through Hoshanos if we have Lulav and Esrog. The Lulav and Esrog are the Hoshanos are considered to be very meaningful tefillos for to have the Lulav and Esrog with, and so the way we're really supposed to interact with the Lulav and Esrog, it's brought in halacha in general. When we hold the Lulav and Esrog, we hold the Lulav in our right hand and the Esrog in our left hand, unless you're a lefty, by the way. If you're a lefty, flip it. Not juggle it, but reverse it. So what happens in Oshanos, and I'll be very honest, I'm a guilty party here, is what like I normally during Oshanos, I kind of hold the Lulav and Esrog together in one hand and I hold my siddur in the other hand. Be honest with you, that's not the ideal way to do it. The ideal way to do it is to hold your Lulav and Esrog each one in one hand and hold them together, with both of your hands, and then find some other way to manage the text of those shadows. So those card things on the wrist are great. You might see some people kind of like keep their arms together and sort of cradle the siddur while they're holding the Lulav and Esrog. more power to them. I concede that's the correct way to do it. I just sort of hold them together in one hand, and then at the end, when I've gotten to my seat, I hold the Lulav and Esrog in the way they're supposed to be held. If a person can manage through one of these other means, it's far better than what I do. But the most correct thing to do is to hold the Lulav and Esrog in separate hands. But you don't put them together, of course. This is a great question. What if you mix up your Lulav and Esrog with your neighbors? What if you mix up your Lulav and Esrog with your neighbors? So it's interesting. So if it's the first day of Sukkos and you realize that you used your neighbor's Lulav and Esrog, really what you should do is you should really get back your Lulav and Esrog. And I would say, to the best of my knowledge and understanding, you should do Lulav and Esrog again with a bracha. Because I thought it was my Lulav and Esrog. I didn't have in mind to acquire your Lulav and Esrog. I wasn't Yotzei on the first day of Sukkot if it wasn't mine. So, so I would say that's the case for the first day of Sukkos. For Chol Hamoed Sukkos, there's a beautiful idea. First of all, in general on Chol Hamoed Sukkos, if I don't have a Lulav and Esrog, I don't have to ask you to give me your Lulav and Esrog. I can ask you to lend me your Lulav and Esrog. That's just, in other words, it's not a requirement that I have to own it once we get to Chol Hamoed. Now, let's say I come to Shul, and by the way, this has happened to me before. I pull out my Lulav and Esrog, before Hallel, because I'm going to do the mitzvah, after the Chazan's finished the repetition. And I look at whatever. I look at my aravos. I notice something on my Lulav, and it was something on my Esrog. Oh my gosh, I'm not sure if this is kosher. So maybe I think I'm better off using someone else's Lulav and Esrog, at least to fulfill the basic mitzvah. So in that case, the normal thing to do is to lean over to someone. Do you mind if I borrow your Lulav and Esrog for a moment? Maybe later and whatever. Let's say there's a perfectly good Lulav and Esrog sitting on a bench, and the owner's not around. Can I just take his Lulav and Esrog? It's a very interesting concept in halacha. A person is very happy for a mitzvah to be done with their possession. That we could assume that if I want to fulfill a mitzvah, that it would be all right with you if I were to fulfill my mitzvah with your item. We can't assume that on something which has natural wear and tear, because every time it's used, it's one step closer to meeting its end. But it's fair to assume that by Lulav and Esrog. I mean, you only need them to be kosher for a week or so. The problem is it's drying out. The problem's not, if you hold it for a minute. So if on Chol Hamoed, if I accidentally confused my Lulav and Esrog with your Lulav and Esrog, I think it's certainly fair to assume that I wouldn't mind if you use mine and you wouldn't mind if I use yours. Now, if for some reason, a person's very, very sensitive about the Lulav and Esrog, and they scream from across the room, "Put down my Lulav and Esrog," then that's probably not the ideal person to mix up Lulav and Esrogs with for more reason than one, including halachically being Yotzei. So thank you to the people who submitted the questions. Thank you very, very much. I hope this makes sense to people. I am happy if anyone has any questions they want to submit to the chat. I'm happy to take any questions. Maybe we'll start with that. If you have a question and you don't feel comfortable putting in the chat, you're welcome to just unmute yourself and just call it out at this point. Okay. I'll give people another minute or two more, but I just want to ask, we're always looking for good subjects. Any suggestions for our next Ask the Rabbi? Feel free to put it in the chat or call it out. I can't guarantee we're going to do it, but I'm certainly happy to hear suggestions.
One question, which
Sure.
I usually try to avoid the problem, make sure, but what is the status of, let's say, we have this year. We have Shabbos Kol Moed Sukkos. It
Yeah,
could also happen. Also be an issue for Shmi Atzer Simchas Torah possibly as well. But certainly for Shabbos would be an issue. If I put my Lulav and Esrog Friday morning, I come home from shul. I put my Lulav and Esrog down on the dining room table. I eat,
yeah,
as long as the weather's good, there's no problem. I'm going to be eating out of my sukkah.
that's right.
But what happens is then, it starts raining. And so I come inside. Now, when I want to set the table, am I allowed to move that Lulav and Esrog?
Great question, Menashe. Thanks for asking it. On Shabbos of Sukkot, the Lulav and Esrog are really, really muksa. Really, really muksa. Um, there's no mitzvah, so they don't have a function in terms of that. You wouldn't even be allowed to use it for other things because it's really designated for mitzvah use for the Yom Tov of Sukkot. So it's really muksa. It's so ironic. If there was a pen on your table, because the pen is something which can be used practically for something, what it can be used for is prohibited on Shabbos, but it's a real functional thing, you could just pick up the pen and move it. But it's so ironic. The lulav is more muksa than your pen. So your only solution is to move it in an abnormal way. If it wasn't
Hopefully, not knocking the Esrog onto the floor and
right,
breaking the pitum.
right. If it wasn't a lulav, I would say just kind of shake the table a little bit or brush it off the table. But I'm not sure I would recommend that for a lulav. So probably the best thing to do would be, for example, to kind of put your elbows together, or something like that. The point is to move it with some type of shinui. Yeah,
Thank
thank
you.
you for raising that, Manash. That's a very valuable question. Okay. Thank you very much, everybody. Thanks for joining. And Miriam, again, thank you very much. And we should all have a ksiva v'chasima tova. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.